Welcome you all to yet another edition of Public Health Biographies. This, as you know, will feature scholars and activists who have shown their eminence and excellence on their professional journey. I am K. Rajashekharan Nair from the Global Institute of Public Health, and my co-host is Dr. Mohammad Shafi from Boston. And we hope a follow-up of their trajectory would help the present and future generations of public health scholars. Because today's students only know about theories, techniques, and strategies, but not the people who created them. Today, I'm extremely happy to present Professor Howard Waitzkin, Distinguished Professor of Emeritus in the Department of Sociology at the University of New Mexico, Adjunct Professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Illinois, and presently he's a Fulbright Senior Fellow with Seoul National University School of Public Health, Division of Healthcare Management and Policy. I'm extremely proud to say that I'm introducing a scholar whose writings have also influenced me during my early days, although that does not indirectly indicate any age difference between us. Let me not waste time in introductions, as this entire program actually is meant to introduce Professor Waitzkin and his work. Let me start with the first question. Personal and professional, one's early life, you know, I mean, many of us, it's equally applicable to all of us. Early life exposures are important in shaping perspectives and of course, theories also, ideological especially. Professionally, you started as a primary care physician in internal medicine. Did this exposure influence your theoretical orientation? And where did you work and what did you experience? This is what we would like to know, I mean, at the beginning of this program. Professor Waitzkin.
Well, first, I just want to thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate. How much time do we have for this question? How many hours?
Well,
how many minutes?
This 10 to 15 minutes you can take.
Okay. Well, in terms of early child problems, you know, early childhood influences, I actually wasn't born as a primary care practitioner. That I guess is obvious. So I thought I would just give a few words about what happened before that happened. You know, I actually grew up in a very precarious working class family in the Midwest of the US in Ohio, small town, about 5,000 people. My parents actually were both office workers and they had precarious jobs. So I grew up living, feeling a great lack of abundance. In fact, a good deal of insecurity, which was real. My parents actually lived through the Great Depression in the USA, couldn't go to college, and actually were frustrated in various ways because they never really had an opportunity to achieve what they wanted to do. For instance, my dad wanted to become an artist. And they actually got laid off, suffered from unemployment, suffered health effects of unemployment. I suffered health effects of their unemployment because we lost our health insurance, etc. So these had a very profound influence on me, just in terms of other people I grew up with. Actually, most of my friends either died in Vietnam or became chronically unemployed. So why that didn't happen to me, I actually cannot explain very well. I think it had mostly luck, actually. And luck is kind of an underappreciated phenomenon, but I think it's actually very important. And in my case, super important, because it was just happening to meet some teachers and other contacts who opened up worlds to me that otherwise would not have happened. So from that background, I actually, in college, became interested in actually community organizing. This was the time of the civil rights movement. I had been active in the civil rights movement from the time I was in, I don't know, grade school, actually, in various ways. We organized a boycott of barbershops when I was in high school, when I was the editor of our newspaper, where the school boycotted the local barbershops because they wouldn't accept Black students for haircuts. They had to go 30 miles to get a haircut. So this was a time when I was in college of the really intense civil rights movement, a period of time that was like now, actually. And it was the time of the Vietnam War. And I was very much, for a variety of reasons, involved in the resistance to that. And to tell you the truth, the reason that I went into medicine was because I became inspired by certain people, in particular Jack Geiger, who had realized that medicine and public health were ways to facilitate organizing and empowerment in marginalized communities. Jack actually led efforts in the first, in the first major development starting in the 60s. There had been efforts before that, but in the USA, the very important developments of community health centers in Mississippi and actually a housing project in Boston, where you are, Sheffy. And so his work and his talks and others inspired me. And so I decided to try to study a little bit more sociology, because I felt, as many learners do, that somehow studying about society should help us be able to improve it, which is an assumption, of course, that's very problematic, actually. But for young idealistic people, like I was, I actually believed in that. And so I did some more graduate school, first at the University of Chicago and then back at Harvard. And it was from that point that I applied to medical school. And in my interviews, I was asked, well, why do you want to go to medical school? And I said, well, because I want to participate in community organizing, which I think was, surprising to people, but I said it in a way that I guess I could justify. So that was my entree to medical school. And then what happened is, and I think I briefed you about this a little bit earlier, the actual reason that I did both, I studied both for my doctorate in sociology and for my medical degree, more or less simultaneously, alternating different periods of time. And then I got both degrees at the same time. And the reason for that actually was financial. I couldn't afford medical school because in the USA, there were actually no fellowships. There were scholarships and big loans. There are even bigger loans now that medical students have to take out. But the American Medical Association had made sure that there are no fellowships to provide adequate financial support for medical students. So I knew that if I went to medical school, as it was, I couldn't survive financially. It was just a fact. And so I went and talked with this administrator at the graduate school who figured out that I could use my National Science Foundation graduate fellowship to be jointly enrolled in medical school and graduate school. And there was a rationale for this, the value of combining sociology and medicine to look at issues of social medicine. But the real motivation for it was so that we could eat and have housing and all that while I was in medical school. So you asked how it happened, and that's how. Now, it was actually, again, very lucky it happened because substantively, it actually did become a very fulfilling career, and a career that was influenced largely by my early experiences of deprivation, both in my family and community, the experience of lack of access to health services, the effects on health of social determination like unemployment and so forth. The other reason that I thought it was very lucky that I did it is because it actually, each field provided comic relief from the other, because I'm sure you're all aware, people in each of those fields, health and social sciences, can tend to be very pompous and self-oriented and think that there's probably nothing more important than what we're doing. So going back and forth between them actually provided some amusement because each kind of deconstructed the other, so to speak, and so it was very challenging. So that's a brief answer. Was there anything that I could clarify beyond that?
Yes, I think that you partially answered my second question. But a lot of people might have asked you why you opted. Whether it really helped you in understanding the society, the social determinants, or I mean.
Right. As far as the theory is concerned, let me actually just respond to that. Part of my graduate school experience was actually both my undergraduate advisor, one of them, and my dissertation advisor was actually Talcott Parsons in sociology, who was the leading advocate for structural functionalism in the social sciences. And this was a theory that was based on the achievement of order in society. And it emerged from actually a seminar of various professors in biology and economics and anthropology and business, who all ascribe to a homeostatic view of systems from the biological level to the societal level. And there were disturbances in the system, but basically there were homeostatic mechanisms to functionally achieve stability in those systems. And I actually, I'm not quite sure why, but I did very well working with Parsons. And so he chose me as one of his prodigies to pursue this theoretical, this was the hegemonic theoretical paradigm in the social sciences at that time. The only problem was it didn't match either my experience growing up or the nature of the society as it was, which was a society characterized by disorder, by conflict, by persecution, by discrimination, by structural racism, by militarism, and so forth. And I actually had this tremendous conflict, moral conflict on the theoretical level, because I realized that the theory that I was using and that I had been chosen to put forward as a leader in the field did not adequately explain what was actually happening in the society at the time. And so it was in that context that I started to study theories of conflict. Although I had looked at some Marx and Engels before that, those particular authors were not allowed to be taught at Harvard at the time because of the history of McCarthyism in the US. So I went through my PhD degree, never having been assigned any readings whatsoever in Marxism, and even the works of Engels, for instance, that directly pertain to social medicine and public health. So that led to a very in-depth, personally directed set of readings on Marxist theory, and both historical Marxist theory and more recent manifestations of it. And I had this very tearful encounter then with about why, on an intellectual and moral basis, I regretfully had to choose not to be his protege. So that's actually a little bit about how I chose the theoretical direction that I've actually stayed with pretty much since that time.
Well, I have come across this work by you. I think you use the term rinky-dink revolution. I mean, largely to do with how the society progresses, or the kind of state it remains at the moment. I mean, with respect to probably the American system. I mean, but I want to ask you, with respect to spread of medical or health system in the world. I mean, do you see the same trend, or maybe something more, I think, than just rinky-dink revolution? I think we need, we would like to know exactly what is the term and what is the context of that use of that term. I think I am familiar with your work, but for the people who are listening to you, I think that's very, very important.
Right. So, what is rinky-dink revolution? So, the context of that title, which is a title of a short book, and we call it a manifesto. Oh, I didn't realize you'd be projecting this. Okay. So this is a recent part of a recent publication and presentation, and it shows the pamphlet. Now, let me just say that here's the motivation for this. Why don't you go on to the next slide? Can you advance the slide?
Yes, one second.
Let me begin while you're doing that. So here we have the problems that all of us confront on a day-to-day basis. Problems of inadequate health services, problems of inadequate health outcomes, problems of inadequate mental health, problems of environmental catastrophe, problems of racism tied to capitalism, what's called racial capitalism, inequality, massive inequality worldwide. We have problems related to gender and gender oppression. We have problems of inadequate education. In many of our countries, we have problems of mass incarceration. We have problems of undereducation and the control of education through ideologies that encourage some types of educational processes and not others. All of these problems, in one way or another, are problems of capitalism, our global political economic system. And what do we do? What do I do as a practitioner of public health and social medicine and as an activist? Well, what I've done and what most of us do is we pick out what are those problems and focus on that to try to make things better as we can. Let's just go, so stop right there. So this is the overview of that. And as you can see, there's capitalism at the top. And it actually, in one way or another, is involved in the causation of all of our major problems in the world today. And, you know, there may be quibbles about whether it's the only cause, but it certainly is a very important cause of all these problems. So what we do, if we look at the bottom and follow the arrows up, is that we pick out one or two of these problems, like in my case, health services, public health, and we focus on trying to make things better in that area. But because we don't address the cause of the problem, capitalism, we end up addressing the effects. And so because of that, we don't actually make a more fundamental change in the very, very difficult problems that confront human beings and other life forms today. And, you know, the question has arisen, and this has been framed by Frederick Jameson, the eminent literary critic, most clearly. It's easy to imagine the end of the world, but it's hard to imagine the end of our economic system. And I think we can all relate to that. You know, we can think of global warming, seas rising, impossible heat, extreme weather, flooding, or fascism, nuclear war, various catastrophes. But putting our imagination how to actually move from A to B, from capitalism to post-capitalism, now that's hard. But that's what's needed now. And we don't have much time left. I used to say, as I'm sure some of you have, I may not live to see the achievement of our goals here, of a reconstructed society that's humane and that supports an equalitarian, mutually a system of mutual aid. But it's still important to continue to try. But unfortunately, because of the rifts that's been achieved by our capitalist global economy, we actually are in a situation of huge crisis, where the time left to deal with these issues on behalf not only of our generation, but of future generations is limited. So we really have to solve that question of how to move beyond capitalism, and especially the very pernicious effects of capitalism. So what Rinky-Dink Revolution is an attempt to rethink and reimagine the meaning of revolution in our time. So the history of revolution, and they're basically in recent, over the last century, the history of revolutions against what has been called racial capitalism have involved both military revolutions, and there have been several societies that have achieved revolutions that way, and some that have achieved it by non-violent revolutions. And there have been problems with both of those approaches. One thing that's almost crystal clear is that the potentiality of achieving revolution through the traditional military means, given the militarization that exists in the world controlled by the global capitalist system, is actually very limited. So that then forces us to examine, well, how can we move from capitalism to post-capitalism without a violent revolution? And so rinky-dink revolution argues that this is possible. And it's possible by doing things, by changing our lives in ways that actually are relatively easy and relatively safe, and that can actually be done by fairly large numbers of people without great hardship. So that's the meaning of rinky-dink. It's something that's easy to do, relatively speaking. And what this booklet and the group that we're working with focuses on is, first of all, withholding consent. So, why does the capitalist system continue to function as it does? It's because we, in the 99% or more, who do not control the greatest amount of wealth in the world, it's actually less than 1% of the world's population, controls much more now than half of the world's wealth. And it's this group of people who actually benefit and spearhead the continuation of capitalism. So rinky-dink revolution, first of all, has to do with how to withdraw consent. And then secondly, it has to do with what we call creative constructions and creative destructions. So very briefly, the creative constructions, these are efforts to move around what you see in that figure, and there are figures later on that show this diagrammatically. And by the way, the pandemics also, I should mention, figure into, they're basically creations of capitalism, mainly because of the destruction of habitat and the industrial production of meat are the main reasons why we have the cross-species development of pandemics. And this applies to basically every viral pandemic that's occurred in the last 50 years. And it's the danger of our next pandemic. So the creative constructions involve trying to figure out what is really needed by all of us to move our lives beyond capitalism. And this almost always involves two main areas. One is housing, and the second is food. These are actually the main challenges economically that we depend on capitalism for: where to live and what we eat. And so the development of solidarity economies that provide inexpensive, accessible housing and locally produced, accessible, nourishing food are actually the main priorities to construct in the post-capitalist solidarity economy. Now, healthcare and public health and education and other human services are also part of that, and there are subgroups that are working on each of those areas. But the main ones actually are housing and food, because those are the main insecurities. Those are the main things that we actually need to resolve economically. And Rinky-Dink Revolution, the short book / manifesto, gives multiple examples of the thousands of organizations worldwide that are actually doing that now, including some that I'm working with very intensely. Now, the other aspect of that is the creative destructions. And these are ways that we withdraw consent from the smooth functioning of the capitalist system and do things in terms of direct action to actually block or at least slow down capitalist production. And the three areas that we deal with are, first of all, tax resistance. So for instance, in the US, in South Korea, where I am now, in many other countries, half of our federal income taxes go to militarism. And half of our local taxes, in terms of property taxes, go to policing militaristic policing and incarceration. And so withdrawing consent from taxes is actually, from those aspects of taxation, is actually an interesting challenge that I've personally done, and at least 20,000 other people in the USA have done for decades now, without a lot of problems. And we take that tax money, and instead of sending it to the US military to be used in Afghanistan or Iraq or parts of Africa or elsewhere in the world, now in relation to China and East and South Asia, we actually direct it into our communities for housing, food, medical care, and other services. The other creative destruction has to do with the way we spend our money. And this relates to the various ways that all of us save and spend money. Our little savings accounts, checking accounts, credit card use, retirement accounts, car loans, home loans, etc. So the process here is to withdraw from all of that, because there are actually other ways that we can use the money that we've accumulated instead of handing it over to enormous financial corporations that take our money and invest it again in these same problem areas that capitalism creates. So those are very important efforts. And this leads to the accumulation of literally billions and billions of US dollars that can be redirected into community-based solidarity economy. And finally, there are direct actions that actually stop or slow down the smooth functioning of the capitalist system. And these don't involve large street demonstrations with police permits. They actually involve efforts like, for instance, the farmers' strikes that have been going on in India, where you actually stop the smooth functioning of the capitalist system. And it's possible to do that. Many examples that are happening in North America and in other continents involve indigenous organizing to block fossil fuel production and fossil fuel transportation. So this was the meaning of the Standing Rock actions that are still going on. They're the meaning of the Line 3 actions that are going on in Minnesota now, and actions in Canada, in Latin America, in Australia, and in many other parts of the world. So they're not violent, but they're aggressive in terms of actually putting a stop to various aspects of capitalist production. So that's a very brief summary of rinky-dink. This is part of a larger effort, and others, that's called Moving Beyond Capitalism Now, which is a series of pamphlets/manifestos jointly published by Daraja Press and Monthly Review that encourages people like all of you to begin to imagine how this looks of actually in the present, moving beyond our capitalist, our very destructive global system of racial capitalism. So I encourage you to check that out and think of participating and exchanging your own analyses of this and your own views and experiences of the directions to head now. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor Howard. I was like going through one of your very earliest works in 1986, I believe, paper on the economic development, political economic system, and the physical quality of life using World Bank data from the World Development Report. So you basically classified countries into capitalist versus socialist economies. And interestingly, you have included India amongst the capitalist countries at that time. So now, maybe 3-4 decades now, do you think that this dichotomy still exists, given the fact that globalization has narrowed the differences between these economies? And in a largely globalized world where there is frequent exchange of goods and services much more than before, will these classification and looking into the health outcomes in terms of the political economy still hold good. And and what are the research opportunities or pathways that new researchers can pursue?
Okay, so thank you for that question, Jeff. That article was published in the American Journal of Public Health. Was the leader on that article? I want to give credit to my dear late colleague, comrade, and friend Shirley Saraceto, because it was actually her understanding of this, and including the understanding of how this could be studied using quantitative data from the World Bank, that actually led to that article. And that article, decades later, still is being used. I get requests regularly. It's regularly reproduced. And one of the reasons for that is that the World Bank stopped releasing data in the way that that type of study could continue to be redone over time. They actually made it impossible. And they did that within a couple of years after the article was published in the mid 80s. And then with the changes with the so-called triumph of capitalism, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which, that involved, I think many people agree now, the worst public health disaster in the history of the world. Within 6 years, a loss of life expectancy of roughly 6 years for men and about 5 years for women in the Soviet Union and other countries of the former Soviet Union. And to be matched probably by the current public health catastrophe happening in the USA, which involves, as it's going, a similar loss of life expectancy for many of the same reasons, actually. So getting back to that article, this was a very simple attempt to study the so-called physical quality of life outcomes that involve health indicators, educational indicators, nutrition indicators that were developed by the World Bank. So it's an index of quality of life. It's a composite index of measures like infant mortality, maternal mortality, educational levels, literacy, women's position in the labor force, et cetera, et cetera. And what Shirley realized, and what I then worked with her on, was to analyze all the countries for which those data were available from the World Bank, and to control through a multivariate analysis involving analysis of variance and multiple regression, to control for level of economic development. So in brief, we had 3 levels of economic development. And at the highest level, there were capitalist countries only at that point. There were no socialist countries. And then at the middle and lower levels of economic development, there were socialist countries. And so we did the comparisons, and we did it pretty rigorously, and using multiple analytic techniques, and using sensitivity analyses where data were missing, and so on. We did the usual good things and we're supposed to do in quantitative analysis. And we found very dramatic results that there were 24 indicators in addition to the physical quality of life index. And in all but 2 or 3 of them, the socialist countries were better at their level of economic development than the capitalist countries. And the reasons for that was because of the systems that could be organized to protect people, to protect health, to protect nutrition, to protect education, and so forth, when the degree of capitalist exploitation that goes on in capitalist countries was not happening. And we included the so-called mixed economies in the capitalist countries. for instance, the Scandinavian economies, or the UK, let's say, or Australia. So if anything, the results were favorable to the capitalist countries, yet the distinctions were very dramatic. So that's a brief summary. Now, there have been innumerable studies since then on the political economy, the political economic factors that determine health, that are involved in the determination of health. And these involve inequality, racism, it involves austerity and neoliberal policies, and many other things. And they're actually published separately, separate articles usually, and there are large numbers of these. There was a systematic review in the American Journal of Public Health a couple of years ago that analyzed several hundred of these studies, which are all very helpful. But the problem is they don't get at the main problem. They don't actually address capitalism. So the C word remains unspoken. Yet that's the issue. That's what has to be confronted. That's a brief answer.
So yeah, maybe just coming back 20, 30 years to the recent period, when 2010 you wrote about you have been very critical of the capitalist economy, but you also very clearly spoke against Obamacare, which the world see as one of the best examples from the US, at least for those who have looked in that way, trying to support the weaker sections of the community of the country. Of course, you have your valid arguments on that. And you even wrote in one of those articles, I remember, that United States invariably does the right thing after having exhausted every other alternative, quoting Winston Churchill. So now it's like around 12, 13 years now. Obamacare went through ups and downs, and now it's struggling to continue. And there are always demands of single payer system, as you have been advocating for a long time. Do you think that the American healthcare system is going to try some of these better options that you have been talking for long years, or do you also think that Obamacare was for a large cause was a good transition at least?
So I was one of the founders of Physicians for National Health program in the 1980s. We wrote the first single payer proposal for National Health program in the US, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1989. And that became the basis for legislation introduced in the US Congress pretty much every year since then. And most recently by Senator Bernie Sanders and several representatives in the US Congress. And it has now over 100 co-sponsors. So that's the model that we favor. And that model essentially gets capitalist corporations out of healthcare and has a single payer system. And why is that necessary? It's necessary because of what the great economist, Marxist economist Paul Swayze said many years ago, which is that for anybody experiencing the US healthcare system, it seems irrational, chaotic, and the worst possible set of arrangements if the goal is to achieve accessible health services and good health. Swayze said, so from that point of view, the system fails completely. But actually the system is extremely successful because health and health services isn't its goal. Its goal is the accumulation of capital, and that it does extremely well. And from that point of view, that's what Obamacare has accomplished and accentuated. And I don't think we have time to get into detail about this, but one of the greatest rhetorical, ideological achievements in the USA in the last generation has been the creation of an image of Obamacare, that this is a proposal of the left that's being opposed by the right, whereas actually it's a proposal of the right that's being opposed by the left. And why is that? It's because Obamacare was actually the creation of the World Bank. It's a neoliberal proposal whose fundamental characteristic is that you take public sector trust funds, in this case Medicaid, which you mentioned, Medicare, and other trust funds, you take it out of the public sector and you move it into private insurance companies and let them deliver services and keep a big part of that as profit. So under Obamacare, the US private insurance industry is its most profitable in history. And it's directly because of that process. The first time that Obamacare was implemented was actually in Colombia, in South America, in 1994. It's exactly the same proposal. And if it's hard to believe, but if you want to see it, I've actually superimposed the structures of the two programs in an article, and you can see that it's exactly the same structure, and it all involves this element of using tax money and moving it into the private sector to provide services that would enable the accumulation of profit. Now, what we can do about single payer, I've become very disturbed, let's say, as many of us have, in the single payer movement. And this is actually one of the things that led to rinky-dink revolution, because the models that we were using of single payer within capitalist countries have basically all been under attack because of neoliberal forces. So the Canadian health system is surviving, but constantly under attack. The UK system, which was one of our models, has been largely privatized and transformed to an Obamacare type structure that's being controlled by private industry. In fact, the leadership of it are graduates of the US private insurance industry, as you well know. And then you look at Sweden and other Scandinavian countries, Holland, same process of privatization and cutbacks in the public sector. So whether a viable single payer system can be achieved long-term at the current stage of global racial capitalism, with all of its chronic, repetitive economic crises, where whenever there's an economic crisis, there will be inevitable cutbacks and privatizations of whatever a single payer national health program is. So that has led to steps of not only working toward congressional approval in capitalist countries of single payer systems, but linking it to efforts to actually move beyond the more fundamental political economic system itself.
So maybe it's time for me to take a question from our listeners. Professor Matthew George of Tata Institute of Social Science, he is asked, it appears that the historical approaches to social determinants of health in social medicine predominantly happened at the macro level. And is that one of the reasons why, despite a lot of acknowledgement of social determinants of health in public health, very less has been translated into real-time action? So before you answer this question, like maybe it's related to that. I have seen, after being here, trying to study the system here, I'm seeing that at least there have been a lot of efforts in the recent period to translate them into action through the community health centers, linking the patients with, like you mentioned, homelessness is a major issue here, or food availability. So some of this I have seen some of this translation happening at the micro level. So this is a really valid question. So do you think that this is a real issue, the translation from the macro level to the micro level?
Is it possible to clarify the meaning of macro? I just want to be sure I understand what is being referred to here.
So so basically it's more macro in nature, and very less has been adopted from the micro or meso approaches in sociology. So basically it's more happening at the higher level of discussions rather than practically getting translated into actions at the health system level.
Okay, so one example of that is the WHO, World Health Organization, report on macroeconomics in health, which argued that achieving better health is the best way to achieve economic advancement. And thus required economic investment by wealthy countries in health services, which failed completely along the lines that this question asks. So I think the better to approach this would be the term social determinants and to contrast it with social determination. And this is a distinction, a very important distinction that I would encourage you all to think about and to familiarize yourself with, and to try to change the vague language that's usually used to describe and to analyze social determination. We actually, in our recent book, just came out called Social Medicine and the Coming Transformation, we go into this distinction in depth in several of the chapters, partly in relation to the pandemic, actually. So, social determinants are conceptualized basically as risk factors, as variables, as components that can be reformed within the context of current structures. And for instance, if you read, okay, all right, so this is actually from a talk that I gave here about it. It argues that the poor health of the poor, the social gradient of health within countries. Did you just go back to it? Actually, why don't you go to the table that follows? There's a table that follows that. Keep going. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead. Once more. Okay, so a little hard to see, but it summarizes the other points. So on the left side are social determinants, and on the right side, social determination. And social determinants are what is described in the WHO report on social determinants led by Michael Marmot and others, which actually is a very interesting report in that Marmot and the other leaders of the commission are very aware that the history of social determination in health actually goes back at least 1.5 centuries to Engels in The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844. But none of that work, more farther back than 20 years before this WHO report, is cited in the report. So this seems like a new discovery, social determinants. It's actually an extremely old concept. It keeps getting forgotten and rediscovered in each generation. And in the book, we talk about that history as well. So social determinants is the hegemonic public health orientation. And social determination is the theoretical and action-oriented, praxis-oriented, to use the perspective you're raising, Shafi, distinction that's made from social determinants. And what we argue is that social determination is a much more meaningful and much more ultimately effective way to understand how social conditions determine health conditions, which is the key question here. So if you look at the left, social determinants see society as a sum of individuals, whereas social determination sees society as a totality, especially in terms of the political economy of a society. The social determinants view sees health, illness as dichotomous states, one or the other. And this permits dichotomous dependent variables that are yes or no, either health or non-health. Either you have cancer or you don't. Either you have heart disease or you don't. Either you have mental illness or you don't. And that permits multivariate logistic regressions that use those dichotomized dependent variables in the equations. But ultimately, it's a very limited way to look at what actually happens in social in the social conditions that we confront. So social determination looks at health illness as a dialectic process. And this actually takes its reference points from Engels, but also much more recent work in biology that adopts Engels' perspective and then it advances it in terms of dialectic biology, particularly the work of Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin, great figures in biology and evolutionary genetics, and both associated with Harvard, actually, one at the Harvard School of Public Health and the other at the Department of Biology. And I'm mentioning that just because that has directly influenced this aspect of social determination, health illness as a dialectic process. So change results from social contradictions that lead to mass movements and social conflicts. Oh, sorry, that's, and then, right. So then the next would be variables at the individual level of analysis as risk factors. So these involve demographic variables like income, education, job, social cohesion, etc. Individual level variables. Whereas social determination sees this as the importance of hierarchies of determination and the importance of production, economic production, and reproduction at the societal level. So it's not a reductionist view of problems to characteristics of individuals, but instead prioritizes the understanding of social determination at the societal level. The next is under social determinants that social position generates different exposures and vulnerabilities, whereas from social determination, hierarchies of determination, production, and reproduction, as I mentioned before. So power relations, accumulation of capital, discrimination, like classism, racism, sexism. These create inequality, exploitation, and chronic stress. And these lead to the embodiment of social conditions. Embodiment is a term that's been developed in the most depth by Nancy Krieger, also in Boston, really excellent work. And this attempts to show how social determination actually happens in the body, how social conditions become embodied and expressed as health outcomes. And this is involved with illness and early death. And then under social determinants, reforms can be achieved through political will. And this is actually a term used in the WHO report. We have to encourage that our leaders, our political leaders, engage in political will to address social determinants, and that these determinants can change as risk factors. and that such changes can occur within the global capitalist system, whereas social determination sees that meaningful, lasting improvements in social determination will happen only through societal transformation, including moving beyond the characteristics of global capitalism that generate illness and early death. So that's a very brief summary of this contrasting set of perspectives. The hegemonic perspective, the dominant perspective in public health on the left, and the challenging perspective that's rooted in the history of social medicine, and then very strongly rooted in Latin American social medicine on the right. And again, I would encourage everyone to at least familiarize yourself with this, extremely profound academic and intellectual work that has gone on. Nancy Krieger actually has edited a series published by Oxford University Press. Her book coming out in 2 months is on embodiment. And the last book that came out is by our dear comrade and colleague, Jaime Breil, who's a very eminent, can be argued as the most creative social epidemiologist in the world now, based in Ecuador. And his book, The People's Epidemiology, was published by Oxford University Press in the same series several months ago. So these are other sources in addition to our book on social medicine and the coming transformation.
Well, thank you so much for that distinction between social determinants and social determination. I think some of us who contributed the background documents for the commission, we were not aware of such differences, although we felt that there are problems, the concepts being used by the commission. But I also want to know, how empowered are doctors? This is my last question. How capable they are to handle social determinants? This is a problem, really. Many clinicians ask, and they are also, unable to cope up with such variables. Although social scientists like us, we talk a lot in terms of social determinants.
Okay, so this is a very important question. I've been working on this question for most of my life. It was actually a key topic of a book that that I wrote years ago called The Politics of Medical Encounters. How patients and doctors deal with social problems. Because what happens in most medical encounters, it happened then, it still happens, except in certain contexts, is that social conditions are always present for our patients. And there's actually a lot of very good research and clinical teaching that's going on now in various places around the world to show how basically almost every encounter that we have, patients come with social conditions that are interrelated with their physical problems that they present. And the social conditions have to be addressed. So how can they be addressed? Well, usually the doctor doesn't have a clue, or any other nurse practitioner, physician's assistant, community health worker. Very, very difficult, given our training and background, to deal with those questions. So what I argued, and what a number of other people have tried to argue and work with, is to try to move beyond capitalism again in the context of health services by creating systems of mutual aid, which is an anarchist concept that has become very widespread now during the pandemic. It's one of the main ways of dealing with the lack of safety net created by our capitalist global economy. So there are systems of mutual aid. There are interactions of activism and advocacy and struggle that can occur on behalf of patients in order to actually change their social conditions. And there, for instance, are medical legal teams where lawyers and community organizers and doctors and nurses can work together on these social conditions that patients confront. And this is actually being done in many areas. We're actually working on a manifesto in the series, Moving Beyond Capitalism, that will offer some further examples of that. Let me just mention that one of the motivations when I did that study was to ask, well, does this happen differently anywhere? And so I actually was going to Cuba that year as part of the semi-annual WHO primary care conference, which still happens in Cuba because of the quality of the primary care system. And after the conference, I decided to try to go out and observe primary care practices, how doctors in primary care there deal with social conditions. And what I found was, and this involved just completely spontaneous, unannounced visits where I would show up and ask the primary care practitioners, can I tag along with you? Oh, and can I do a video? And that became part of a chapter of that book. So what happens is, let's take a situation like one of these patients. So this was an Afro-Cuban patient who had been hospitalized in the intensive care unit the weekend before because of methanol poisoning from brewing home brewed liquor. So she was, ingesting methanol, became acidotic, developed, retinal problems, the whole thing. She was discharged. She was at home. The primary care practitioner was required to see her among every other patient in her catchment area. And so we visited the home, and the lady, the doctor asked the lady, well, so how are you doing? And she said, well, I'm really not sick anymore, but the problem here is my bathroom. I mean, just look at it. The wall is falling down in my bathroom. And the doctor said, oh, that's a real problem, isn't it? So, yeah, we can take care of that. So we went to see other patients, then went back to her office, and she calls up the municipal governments. This was in a relatively so-called working class area of Havana, which is an interesting story. So that's called people's power, poder popular. And this is elected government. This is how democracy functions. 95% of Cubans vote for their municipal government directly, and they run for office, and most of them aren't members of the Communist Party. So these are the people that she called up. So she said, I have this patient. She just got out of the hospital, but her main problem is her bathroom is falling apart. Can you help? Ningún problema, doctora. No problem. We'll organize voluntary work brigade on Sunday to fix your bathroom. And that's exactly what happened. So a group of volunteers organized by the municipal government comes out and rebuilds the lady's bathroom. And, there were probably 7 or 8 other examples in the same morning of other social conditions that were affecting her, this doctor's patients that she dealt with in the same way. Now, if this came up in the United States, let's say one of my patients said, my bathroom is falling apart. Can you do something about this? Call a social worker. It's like there's no infrastructure and no conceptualization of how this actually could happen. So that's what what many of us are trying to do. Again, putting our imagination around how to move from A to B, from an exploitative, non-caring, non-supportive political economy to social conditions that actually are supportive and benefit life as opposed to profit.
Well, let me conclude. I think you used the data from Kerala in a paper on COVID recently, which you shared with me for my comments. But I was quite surprised. I mean, I think you should visit us. I mean, on your way back to US from Seoul. I think that we will be able to host you here. I mean, let me conclude by saying a huge thank you for this so creative interaction. I know this is not the end of our association, and the questions will continue mutually. I'm sure. I mean, thanks again from all of us who joined this program. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Much appreciated.
And next in the series is Professor A.P. Dash, distinguished scientist on neglected tropical diseases, first week of September. Thank you so much.
Thank you.